Okay, I think we'll make a start. A very good afternoon to everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar. This is the second in our Scheme Sessions Volume 2 series. We're looking at a theme of how we can protect pension schemes and their members. Last week, we looked at protecting pension schemes in the context of corporate takeover. In a couple of weeks, we'll be looking at protecting pension schemes and their members in the context of risk transfer. But today's topic is how we protect schemes and members in a situation where the employer is in a distressed situation. The webinar will be running for about 45 minutes to 1 hour. You'll see on your screens that there is a Q&A button, so that enables you to type in any questions you might have as we go along. We will try and take those questions as we come. Apologies if we don't get through them all. We'll pick up separately with you afterwards, but we will try and take as many of those as we can. I'm delighted to welcome our two guests this afternoon to help us through this topic. First of all, warm welcome to Rachel Croft. Rachel is a very experienced director of the professional trustee firm ITS, Independent Trustee Services, representing the firm on a wide variety of scheme appointments. And Rachel's got some very real experience of guiding trustee boards through situations where the sponsor's in distress, and she'll be able to share some of the practical and tactical points that have come out of that experience. So a warm welcome to Rachel. And secondly, Tom Pringle is our other guest, and Tom's a partner with me at Gowling. Tom leads the firm's London restructuring and insolvency team and advising various parties at different stages on the distress curve. Again, Tom has a wealth of experience to draw on, and he'll be helping us understand the legal and commercial drivers in these sorts of situations from the different perspectives of all the parties. So we're going to go through a couple of situations. In particular, we're going to look at how trustees can address distress situations before there's an insolvency situation. And then we'll look a little bit at what kind of insolvency situations can occur, formal insolvency situations, and how should trustees deal with that. And then we're going to just come back to sort of what lessons we can learn having thought about those things in terms of, you know, maybe when the times are better, what trustees might do to put themselves in a better position should things change. And I'm sure with the experience that we've got from Rachel and Tom, that you'll get some valuable insights. Okay, so without any further ado, let's move on to the sort of situation before a formal insolvency process has started. And I'd like to open up with you, Rachel, if I may, looking at what are the warning signs that trustees should be looking out for? I mean, is it when everything changes, or are there specific things that you'd be looking out for?
Thanks, Jason. And yes, absolutely. And of course, the warning signs will be many and varied and will differ across the range of schemes and scenarios. But a very obvious one, of course, would be a request from the sponsor to defer contributions to the scheme if any are being paid at the current time. But that won't always be necessary or something that the sponsor will want to do. So it can be a bit more subtle than that. If you have the benefit of an information sharing protocol or regular covenant monitoring in place, then you'll probably see that something like a decline in performance or a reduction in the cash position or headroom in borrowing facilities might be clear to you. You might even see signs of increased monitoring by the sponsor's lenders, possibly even covenant waivers. If you don't have that in place or things aren't so clear, then other signs will vary depending on the sector and the type of organisation. But potentially some examples might be loss of a key customer or sudden change of senior personnel within the organisation, perhaps new or different advisors being appointed, or even frequent late payment of scheme supplier invoices could be a sign and prompt some questions.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and really useful sort of things to look out for there. And I mean, Tom, actually, just sort of ask you in terms of that would sort of match up with it for other stakeholders and the kinds of things they're looking out for too.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're a trade creditor, obviously you're keeping tabs on payments and payment patterns, and if there's any change to payment patterns, seeking to move from quarterly payments in advance to monthly payments in advance, for example. Also, you'll know as a trade creditor or as a lender to a certain business or certain sector which sectors are particularly struggling at the moment. Any energy hungry sectors at the moment, any sectors that have been traditionally been heavily reliant on EU labour at the moment are particularly struggling. So I think you need to have a general awareness of what the commercial pressures are in the sector that your sponsor operates in.
And Tom, when you're thinking about this then from the other side, and you've got the actual sponsor company in terms of its board, and they're working through a situation of times of difficulty, I think it'd be helpful for many of the audience to understand what the duties are for that board, and sort of when they maybe flip from shareholders to creditors, because largely on this webinar we'll have pensions people, so I think it'd be helpful to hear from you as to what's going on there.
Okay. Well, in normal times, to the extent there have been any normal times of late, all directors have to simply ensure they're managing the company that they're a director of in accordance with the company's constitutional documents, and ensuring they comply with their statutory obligations. They're subject to general statutory duties, the purpose of which is to protect those with the ultimate financial interest in the company. And for a solvent company, that would usually mean its shareholders or its wider group. And those general duties are set out in the Companies Act. In summary, they're to act within powers, promote the success of the company, exercise independent judgment, and that remains vital throughout, exercise reasonable care and skill, avoid conflicts of interest, not to accept benefits from third parties, and to declare an interest in any proposed transaction or arrangement. Now, once a company is insolvent or of doubtful solvency, and that there's a real risk arises that the interest of creditors could become prejudiced, the duties of directors change so that that primary duty to those with a financial interest in the company switches from its shareholders to its creditors, as you suggested, Jason. In a group situation, which we often deal with, this change can be particularly challenging, as each group company within a structure can have its own common directors, and the same 4 or 5 people can be directors of every company in the group, and be used to, when they're making the decisions, considering the interests of the group as a whole, with various intergroup transfers and loans, and an employee for this company really works for that company. But as soon as the company becomes of doubtful solvency and that interest of creditors is engaged, each board must separately consider the interests of their own creditors. And then the duties that I've listed must be seen through that prism. I mean, those duties survive, but with the shift of where that ultimate duty lies. So I suppose the question then is, when am I insolvent, or when am I of doubtful solvency? And then you've got to look at the 2 main tests of insolvency. You may trigger one, but not the other. If you're triggering one, you should prudently be acting in the interest of creditors. So they are that the company cannot pay its debts as they fall due, which is the liquidity or the cash flow test, and that the liabilities of the company, and the complication is including contingent and prospective liabilities, are in excess of its assets. So you're looking at the balance sheet test there. Now, the cash flow test is usually pretty clear to reach a conclusion on. Are you paying your creditors as they fall due, or are you not? And it's that test that, under general normal circumstances, without this a lurking pension scheme problem, is the main concern for most directors and creditors, as long as they can continue to pay their debts. And if they're looking vaguely profitable for the short to medium term, then it's usually the right decision to continue to trade. However, the balance sheet test is a particularly tricky test for a director to come to a conclusive view on, given, as I said, the need to take those contingent and prospective liabilities into account. Because contingent and prospective liabilities can emerge and fade, and they haven't yet crystallized, and they can fluctuate significantly in value. And any deficit to a pension scheme is a prime example of this. So at what point is your balance sheet test engaged? It's very tricky to say, and will very much depend on the advice you get, financial and legal advice at the time. There's no clear-cut answer, from an objective perspective. So where this general duty to creditors is triggered, there are 2 real main areas of concern for the directors, and I'm leaving aside pensions concerns for now. Firstly, the provision under the Insolvency Act will enable the court, on an application of administrator or liquidator, to order that a director has to make a personal contribution to the company's assets. And this is either for misfeasance, for entering into transactions that shouldn't have been entered into, preferring certain creditors above others, transactions that are undervalued, putting assets beyond the reach of creditors, or those relating sometimes to fraudulent trading, but more usually to wrongful trading. Wrongful trading, the issue there is engaged when there ceases to be a reasonable prospect of a company avoiding an insolvency, and the company continues to trade anyway. Any deficit in the balance sheet or in the creditor position between that point where there ceases to be a reasonable prospect of avoiding insolvency and the point you actually stop trading, the directors can be on the hook for that entire deficit for that period, unless they take every step to minimize losses to creditors. So that's obviously something that will really focus directors' minds. It's something that was suspended during the pandemic, but is very much back now. And then secondly, directors can face disqualification for acting as director in the formation and management of a company. Then we're not going into the Pension Scheme Act duties and potential liabilities for contribution notices and criminal liabilities in depth here, but directors of sponsors that are weighing up this interest to creditors as a whole are not permitted to prefer any creditor over any other than for genuine commercial reasons, have a real problem, because they have that duty to act in the interest of creditors as a whole, but then they have the additional specific duties to specifically protect the pension scheme, which could conflict with their general duties. So there's a very difficult balancing act the directors of a company in this situation receive, with threats of liability coming from all sorts of angles. So we're looking from a trustee's perspective here, that trustees will need to work to make sure they keep the scheme at the top of that list.
Tom, in that context, when you've got the directors under that pressure, so how would you advise trustees that they ought to engage with that board, the board of their sponsor, through that period?
Well, I think they need to, engagement in itself is the right thing to do. You need to get yourself a seat at the table and make yourself and make the scheme the pressing problem. It would be easy from a commercial perspective, where directors are, it can be whack-a-mole, or putting out fires that threaten the existence of the company in the short term. So if you've got the revenue threatening a winding up petition, essential suppliers threatening to pull their supplies until you pay them, you've got payroll you have to make, you've got a bank who can pull funding or pull your overdraft at any point. You've got an awful lot of competing parties trying to put themselves at the top of the pile. So you need to engage, make sure that those duties under the Pension Scheme Act are very much at the top of directors' minds, and ensure that you are the problem that they have to solve today. The old adage of the squeaky wheel getting the grease is very much in play.
Yeah, thanks. So Rachel, Tom's just been sort of talking us through the way in which the directors of the board are having to act, and how potentially that means the trustees need to relate to them. And looking at it a bit more widely from the trustees' perspective, so how do you manage communications with the sponsor, but also members, the regulator, through this challenging period?
That's a really good question, Jason. And from my perspective, stakeholder communications, if I can call it, that's probably one of the most important roles of the chair of trustees in these circumstances, and it's continual and ongoing. At each development, and there could be many and varied in a short space of time, it's important to consider which party or parties need to be informed or consulted, made a request of, or asked for a decision, and it's an iterative process, I think. Even in a fast-paced situation, I think it's important to plan these communications in advance, even phone calls, and even if you can just take 5 minutes before a conversation to sort of plan and perhaps strategize which areas are likely to be difficult to communicate, and how this can be done objectively and in a straightforward way. might sound obvious, but it's aimed to stay calm and positive, albeit realistic, I think, in this sort of scenario. So in relation to the sponsor, hopefully there's already a good working relationship with the sponsor company as a starting point. If not, that needs to be built fairly quickly. You mentioned the pensions regulator, and I would also include the pension protection fund. It's important to inform them of the situation at the appropriate point, and also what actions the trustees are taking in response to the situation. I would say the earlier the better for this. And if you're in a situation where you're debating whether it's time to communicate with the pensions regulator and the pension protection fund, then you're probably there already, I would say. Keep them up to date, respond promptly to their questions, and engage with pension protection fund contingency planning. And on this, there's some very helpful guidance on pension protection fund's website. And also encourage the sponsor to communicate directly with the pension protection fund and the pensions regulator where that's appropriate. With regard to members, this is always a difficult one. You need to think carefully about when to communicate as well as what. Certainly if the situation becomes public. Otherwise, when there's been a concrete development, but not every twist and turn along the way, it's important to strike a balance, I think, between openly informing members and not causing them undue concern.
Thanks, Rachel. I mean, I think there's a really important point, and I think they can't be underestimated. So we're going to come on in a moment to a bit more around sort of what legal levers trustees might have and some other levers. But I think those communication pieces, from my experience, are absolutely crucial through this kind of process. And where I'd like to just go next is to think a little bit more about, well, what is it other parties in this scene are doing, so like other creditors, banks, lenders, for example, and then we'll look at what the trustees' levers are and how, to Tom's point, trustees can then make sure they're getting a seat at the table to engage in this. So Tom, just turning to you first, just so we can all understand a little bit more, what might we be expecting lenders and other major creditors to do in this period?
Well, Rosie, thanks for bringing up the waterfall of payments there. I think this is useful to give the context for the outcome if an insolvency process does take place. And this informs what position that all of the other parties will take. This shows the waterfall of payments, a priority of payments in an insolvency. As you'll see at the very top, are fixed charge holders. So if you, as trustees or a lender, has security over bricks and mortar or plant and machinery, and that is worth more than you are owed, then you are fine. You've got nothing really to worry about there. But as you sneak further down the waterfall, you've got more of a problem. Expenses of the insolvency, if this is an administration or liquidation, would usually come in next. So that's the administrator's fees. It's any expenditure they incur while trading during an administration. It's the sale, the cost of selling the business. It's the rent during the period of administration. It's the legal fees. All of that would usually come in next. However, I'll go into in a bit more detail later, but under the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act that came in 2020, the new procedure called the moratorium has come in. Now, this is a standalone process where a company can buy breathing space from its creditors. So any enforcement is prevented. You get a holiday for your debts that predate the start of the moratorium to give up breathing space to rescue a company. And it has to be the company rescued as a going concern here, not just the business like in an administration sale. So now any debts that arise during that period of a moratorium, if the moratorium then fails to result in the rescue of the company and administration follows, that comes in next ahead of the costs of the insolvency. So before you even start the normal waterfall, this moratorium debt can come in next. Then you would get the preferential creditors, that's usually the employees. Then secondary preferential creditors, a new set of creditors in the waterfall. Now, predominantly that is HMRC. which used to have priority status back in 2002. That was gone, and the prescribed part replaced it for unsecured creditors. But the revenue is now back for any VAT payments that have not been paid, any employers' PAYE or NIC that hasn't been paid. The revenue then gets paid before anybody else does. So that is a real hit to unsecured creditors and a real hit to floating charge holders. The prescribed part comes in next. That's another carve out from the floating charge for up to £800,000 for unsecured creditors. Then your floating charge comes. So any lender with a floating charge and only a floating charge is, if there's any VAT liabilities, and particularly if there's any moratorium that's come in, that's suddenly not worth very much at all. And any lender there is commercially can be an unsecured creditor effectively, and only has the benefit of a debenture, say, to the extent that they can control any administration process. And then and only then do your unsecured debts, which a pension scheme without security would come in there, way down the pecking order, and before the shareholders, but not really ahead of anyone else. And that is it's a significantly worse position to be in now, particularly that the revenues preference has come in. So with that context, what will other creditors and other stakeholders be doing? Everybody will be protecting their own interests and desperately trying to scrabble up that waterfall if they know or suspect that is what is going on. So that's either moving themselves up a category in the waterfall by getting security or getting better security, or simply to get paid as much as possible before an insolvency process kicks in and that waterfall begins to flow. So you can look at the cash flow forecast and the balance sheet and the security structure of a company to work out, what people's drivers may be here. But actually, that can only tell you so much. It's as important, if not more important, to know who either the individuals or the organisations the company's dealing with, how they operate and what their drivers are. So if you're looking at a lender, is that lender secured, and over what? If they have security over the bricks and mortar, as I've said, and there's plenty of equity in it, then they will be likely to be more relaxed and more inclined to delay repayment because they know they're covered. There may even, if there's enough equity, be scope for a second charge for a key creditor, such as a difficult set of pension scheme trustees. If the lender only has a debenture, then it has a power to control an insolvency process, but that could actually be worth very little commercially in an insolvency. So what the lender may be doing in those circumstances is be really keen just to keep that business afloat, to keep up repayments, because that's our only hope of getting repaid. Then you need to look at who is the lender. If it's a major clearing bank with a focus on treating customers fairly and a keen eye on PR or a healthy fear of the tabloids, then you will probably have more time than if the debt has been assigned a couple of times and it might have ended up in the hands of one of the more aggressive international debt funds who are perfectly happy to bust a company for a quick buck. Then you look at the trade creditors. I mean, what is their motivation? The biggest trade creditor, their motivation may actually be this sponsor is too big to fail for them. They need to get the company to survive, so they'll give a supportive approach, a willingness to delay or reduce payments. Do they just simply want to draw underliners to this and get paid in full ASAP, or at the extreme, and in certain sectors it's more common, have relations deteriorated to such an extent that they just want to bring the company down to set an example? And if so, a winding up petition could be imminent, and at that point all bets are off and any planned process it can often be out of the window. Where are they with HMRC? Have they breached a time to pay agreement? Then again, a winding up petition could be imminent. So you need to know the numbers, but you need to know your opposition, and I suppose to know, are they a friend, a foe, or is the jury still out? So how much of these various stakeholders take into account themselves the threats of their own liability under the Pension Scheme Act? So getting around the table and getting to know these stakeholders and what each of their drivers are is key, because whatever the legal position is, no two situations are the same given the individuals involved.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And again, it's really helpful. And my experience in working in these situations is it's so important important to involve the likes of yourself to get an understanding of who the various different stakeholders are and what game is being played by each of those. And Rachel, turning back to you then from the trustee perspective, having heard from Tom as to what some of the other stakeholders will be doing, it then becomes really important, I think, for our trustees to think, well, what are the levers I have in this game to play, and how do I decide what to use when? I just wondered if you could perhaps just pick that up a bit further.
Yes, of course, and thanks for that, Tom and Jason. So as you say, I mean, I think we've said a couple of times already, no situation is going to be the same as any other. So I think it's overall carrying out scenario planning as a trustee board and with advisors is extremely useful. So running through a number of potential what if, so as to understand how the situation might evolve and what the range of actions might be for the trustees. And you might find that you come back to this several times. I think it's key to understand as context for this, firstly, the powers under the trusteedom rules, which will differ in different situations. And secondly, the potential financial outcome for the scheme in any subsequent insolvency. So specific levers that you might pull might include, from a legal perspective, those powers under the trusteedom rules. For example, you might have the ability to require additional contributions in the specific scenario, or even wind up the scheme and trigger a Section 75 debt, and what would trigger those powers, and again, coming back to the financial impact, what would actually be the impact of using those powers? Would there actually be any benefit in doing so? Then, of course, have an eye on any covenant protection that you have in place. Is there any contingent security, and how and when would that be triggered? Investment is an important consideration, actually, and very much in the hands of the trustees, of course, with consultation with the sponsor. Can or should the investment strategy be de-risked in the light of the sponsor covenant concerns, and is this even possible in the timescales that you've got? It may go without saying, but information provision is fundamentally important, and increasing the frequency of dialogue and or escalating contact within the sponsor organisation, if possible, can be very helpful. Can the trustees, for example, be provided with the same monitoring information as other parties and at the same time and frequency to save time and cost and create efficiencies all round? In certain scenarios, and to be considered with care and based on specialist advice, use of external communications, either reactively or proactively, is another lever that could be pulled.
Thanks, Rachel. And just on that one, in terms of, I guess, the potential for benefit, there's also, I guess, the potential for danger as well. So I just wondered if you have any other thoughts as to just how trustees are careful in that using of sort of external media.
Yeah, and I think I used the word care. You used the word careful, and I think that was my top tip. But I think the first probably tip is to engage with that subject in the first place, and it's pretty far removed from business as usual trusteeship, but it can be quite important in a distressed situation, even if no external communications are ever issued. And obviously, none of us actually want the attention of journalists or politicians on the scheme or the trustee board. But you might not have a choice if the sponsor is high profile and is already in the news. And that's why preparation is very important. So I would suggest that trustees treat external communications as they would any other discipline in relation to pensions. So if you need legal input, you'd go to a lawyer. Covenant input, you'd go to a covenant advisor. Funding input, you go to an actuary. So I would say if you need external communications input, go to a specialist, and ideally engage them and onboard them in advance if that's possible. and also have a fully thought out strategy. Make sure you understand the range of relevant stakeholders who might be interested in the scheme and how you might reach them if you ever need to. And prepare to either be in reactive mode, that is if the situation becomes public without your doing, or proactive mode, and be able to switch from the first of these to the second if needed. Timing is very important too, as is a need to understand the risks and how to manage broader stakeholders who are potentially impacted by anything that you do or don't do in this space. A couple of don'ts too, one of which, and the most important, is don't even attempt external communications as a trustee, either reactively or proactively, if you haven't been through something like the steps I've just outlined. But on the other hand, don't dismiss it. Don't assume that you don't need to consider this, because depending on the circumstances, you might not have a choice because you might not be the one driving this.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I think, my takeaway from listening to you and Tom here is that from a trustee perspective, it's really important, and I think we've used the phrase together before, strategizing the leverage you have as a trustee, but also strategizing the timing of using it. And I guess sometimes it'll be right to be very proactive as a trustee. There'll be other moments and times when you just have to try and have a little patience to just sort of let things play out a bit. And I think one of the really important things for trustees is to be thinking carefully about that timing and when to use the different levers. So sometimes in these situations, we then see that a transaction unfolds in a solvent scenario. Now, something comes out of it where actually there needs to be, say, a refinancing or some other kind of transaction that takes on a solvent basis, takes things forward. And I guess refinancing might often be one of those things. And Tom, there's been quite a lot written about that recently, and how trustees in particular should deal with that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty helpful actually for the purposes of this webinar that David Fairs wrote an article last month setting out what the pensions regulator expects both the sponsoring employees and the trustees to consider when refinancing. I won't go through all of that in detail here, as you could easily read it yourselves, but the key sentence in that for me was that it's critical to understand the implications of any refinancing on the pension scheme and the employer covenant, and to mitigate to the extent possible any detriment caused. And obviously, to the extent possible is doing a lot of heavy lifting in there. So you, as trustees, getting to really understand the detail along with your advisors of what is being proposed here, how it affects the pension scheme, and what, if anything, you can do about it, either using legal powers or your soft power. So you need to know what it's going to do to interest, to the actual structure of the debt and security, any covenants, or who the new counterparty is. Could this be assigned to a new counterparty? Could, for example, a more aggressive debt fund step in here? You need to understand everything that is changing and understand what you can do about it. So again, early engagement and getting that seat at the table is vital. You don't want to be presented with a fait accompli that is either do this or the company has no future. So there really is an onus on the trustees to be proactive and to really understand any transaction and the current and proposed structure of the debt and security. And obviously there's an onus on the lenders and the sponsors particularly to consider the issue, the pension scheme, and how it affects the pension scheme as well. You need to know how any changes are affecting the scheme's position in the waterfall I went through earlier. New money, be that from a new lender or a new advance from an existing lender that's covered by security, may, for example, save the employer's business, so you still have a solvent sponsor. But if this is secured debt, then it could really drop the scheme down the waterfall and put the scheme out of the money when the money runs out. So trustees need to really carefully consider there what is preferable from the scheme's perspective. Is it an insolvent, a bust employer with a pension scheme high in the ranking so that they'll get a decent slug of cash out if there's an insolvency now, or an employer that's been refinanced that struggles on, but with the scheme further down the pecking order. So there's got to be a significant period of trading, recovery and profit before the scheme is back in the money again. So it's that's something that trustees and their advisors will need to weigh up very carefully.
Yeah, and Rachel, from your perspective, from the trustees' perspective, presumably, once you start to see a transaction take shape, that is a moment when the trustee really does need to be proactive to make sure those levers we've talked about are brought to the fore.
Absolutely, and of course it will depend on the trustees' powers in relation to the scheme, and also on the trustees' view on the prospective viability of the underlying business involved. And these are questions that the trustees will no doubt come back to more than once. It can also present an opportunity. So thinking back to Tom's really helpful waterfall chart and the comments he's made already, is there an opportunity, even in this sort of scenario, to seek increased protection for the scheme, for example, through a second charge? So as we said, in general, in this sort of scenario, requesting information and being kept up to date is key. Ideally, before heading into this specific scenario, i.e. a refinancing, as trustees, you would already have knowledge of the current facilities for ease of comparison. And then you'd want to understand the difference between key terms of the existing facilities and the proposed new financing. And of course, you would ideally be seeking mitigation if the sponsor entering into the proposed refinancing would result in detriment. And it goes without saying, as we've said before, seek specialist advice in this scenario.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I think, again, just sort of pulling together the threads from both yourself and Tom, it seems clear to me that it's important for the trustees to really be understanding those different powers, those different leverage, but to really not be shy and standing back at that point once you get into the transaction, and to be engaging fully. Just a slightly different tack that we haven't picked up so far, and made Rachel turn to you on this one, is just in terms of, as a trustee and a professional trustee, perhaps bringing along a board of lay trustees with events like this that can often be concerning as well for some members of the board, given their involvement in the sponsor, which is in distress, and also the advisory team. How do you pull that piece together to make sure you can really deal with these situations?
Thanks, Jason. And again, another key part of the role of the chair of trustees, I think, or the professional trustee on the board. So taking the trustee board first, I think, agree as soon as you can how, as a board, how the situation will be led and by whom. And that could be a delegation to a small number, for example. You'll need to agree how you're going to manage any conflicts of interest in the scenario, and depending on the role in the sponsor organisation, some of the trustees may be able to continue, others might need to be recused from involvement for a period. So as I've said, it's likely to need, because these situations can be very fast paced, it's likely to need delegation to a small number from the trustee board. So it's important to agree how the wider trustee board will be kept updated, how their views will be sought, and how any decisions will be made. And I found that frequent brief calls are a good idea to keep everybody up to speed and on the same page. Even trustees who are not in perhaps part of a small group are very likely to need some training in this area. Turning to advisors, I think as a trustee, I would always want to have the right people in the right roles, ideally planned in advance. And that may be different from or additional to members of the usual advisory team. So it's good for the usual contacts in all of the key areas, so legal, actuarial, covenant, to have identified colleagues who can be brought onto the team at short notice. Agree how you're going to commission and obtain advice in a fast-paced situation. And very importantly, I think, give your advisors permission to think outside of their specific roles and work as a team. And And as well as thinking about the technical skill sets, so I've mentioned already legal, and by legal, I mean both pensions and restructuring advice, and also covenant, actuarial, investment, and as we've mentioned earlier, external communications and also member communications. Ensure that you have diversity of style in the team, I've found to be very important. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean a range of different sort of roles in a sort of soft skills sense, if I can put it that way. So you ideally you don't want everybody to be fast paced. You definitely want some of that, but you also need members of the team who can be very calm and measured. You definitely need a devil's advocate, and you need a lateral and creative thinker, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I think that's a really interesting point, because sometimes we look at these issues, and certainly as advisors as well, we can be very technical in our thinking, that we've got to let's work out what rule 5.6 says and section this, that, and the other. And actually, these are very real human situations that are going on live, and that whole sort of personality and human element of all of this ends up being very critical, I think. I'd like to just take a move on then, just to think now about, well, what happens if there is a formal insolvency process that happens? And I think one of the things that's important for us as pensions people to understand from Tom is what are all these different insolvency processes and procedures? Because there's a lot of them, and there's a certain language about them. And I think it's important trustees understand them, because the sponsor will be talking with its advisors about them as potential ways forward. And some of them, as Tom will now take us through, some of them have implications, for example, triggering Section 75 debts or a PPF assessment period, but others don't. Particularly, Tom, I think some of the more recent insolvency processes.
That's right. I think we should have a slide coming up to assist me here. There we go. As you can see, yes, as Jason mentioned, there are quite a few of these, and a few more than there were a couple of years ago. The pandemic has really accelerated many things, including developments in insolvency law that have been on the back burner for a number of years. So I've broadly listed these in order of most to least terminal. And you will see the tick on the cross as to whether they trigger Section 75. And there's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for all of them where that does or does not apply. But to rattle through quickly, because I'm conscious of time, compulsory liquidation, this is where a creditor who is owed £750 or more, it was increased to 10,000 for the pandemic, but now it's come back down again, issues a winding up petition, and the court orders the compulsory liquidation of the company. So it's a fairly brutal end to a company. As soon as a petition is issued, a bank would usually freeze the company's accounts. So even if a company wasn't insolvent really at the time a petition was issued, it can very quickly become insolvent as a result of it, as a house of cards can very quickly be brought down there. Any payments made between the issue of a petition and the making of a winding up order, which could be a couple of months later, are automatically void, so need paying back unless you get a special court order. So that's really catastrophic, a compulsory liquidation. Creditors' voluntary liquidation is still an insolvent liquidation, is what we have seen a huge spike in the last few months. It's effectively a burial of a company where there is no business to save. There's nothing to save here. It might sell some assets and distribute what's left amongst the creditors. That is company-led as opposed to creditor-led, but it is not a happy end for a company because there's usually very little, if anything, to distribute. And that's the worrying trend we're seeing at the moment, where there's an awful lot of those about. Members' voluntary liquidation, you would usually see that in a group restructure. And the reason that won't trigger Section 75 is a solvent process. The directors will give a declaration that all creditors will be paid in full. Members' voluntary liquidations, if, say, an asset isn't worth what you thought it was, or a new creditor comes out of the woodwork, can be converted into creditors' voluntary liquidations, at which point the Section 75 is triggered again. Administration can be terminal, usually is terminal, but is usually or very often results in the rescue of the business, not the company, but the business. And it's often sold in what is known as a pre-pack, where the business and assets are sold immediately upon the appointment of the administrators. So it's an insolvency process, but it's the one where there is something to rescue here. There's a good business, albeit one maybe buried under a terrible balance sheet. This can be a really positive thing, saving jobs, saving businesses, helping with this rescue culture. But if you're a large unsecured creditor, such as a pension scheme, you could very easily be left behind here and see a business phoenixing itself, you could say, and surviving without being lumbered with your debt. And that's when there's a bit of a problem for all concerned. Administrative receivership is the predecessor to administration. We don't really see that very much. You only see that if there is a debenture predating September 2003. And that does trigger Section 75, but there's slightly different duties of where the receivers only owe duties to the lender who appointed them rather than all the creditors. Fixed charge or LPA receivership, that doesn't trigger Section 75. The reason being that is only an appointment over a specific asset, over a specific property, usually can be bank accounts, can be shares. But a receiver is appointed over a specific property, they sold that, it doesn't affect the management or ongoing trading of the business as a whole, unless the commercial effect of seizing that property does that. CVA, company voluntary arrangement, does trigger the PPF, and it is when the nominee, the insolvency practitioner, files a report with the court that they think there's a reasonable prospect of this succeeding, is what triggers the Section 75 debt, and then the PPF does have the voting rights of the trustees in that situation. This is a compromise with creditors. Traditionally, it would be creditors accept X pence in the pound over X number of months or years as a compromise of their debts, it being a lot better than the alternative of usually a liquidation. 75% in value of the creditors and 50% of non-connected creditors have to vote that through. What this has been used for a lot in recent years is compromising landlords and ditching leases, highly controversially, but no challenges to that have been successful as yet. I'll move on to the scheme of arrangement next, because it gives context to the next one. That is a court-sanctioned compromise with creditors or shareholders, often used in respect of a group restructure, so it can be a solvent scenario, or it can be used usually on large international groups where certain creditors need to be compromised, certain classes of creditors need to be compromised, and that requires the majority of any affected class of creditors to vote that through, and then a court has to give the seal of approval that it is a genuine compromise. Then we move to the restructuring plan, which is a new process coming in 2020. We're starting to see a few of these coming through and finally starting to filter down to the mid-market from just being used for the likes of Virgin previously. It is a scheme of arrangement with an additional complication of, it's easy for me to say, cross-class creditor cramdown, which means that the creditors can be parceled up into different categories. That can be controversial in itself as to where you end up. And some groups of creditors can be compromised, whereas others remain whole or others are compromised less. And even if your class of creditors votes that you do not want to be compromised, the rest can still push it through. Now, the reason is that this gets rid of the cut your nose off to spite your face creditors who just want this to fail and could do in a scheme of arrangement, or those creditors who, in the alternative, be it administration or liquidation, they're not going to see a penny, or they're only going to see a little bit. And although they're compromised more than other people here, they still are no worse off than they would be in an alternative situation. So this is where it seems puzzling to me that it doesn't trigger Section 75 when a CVA does, and there is more scope for a certain class of creditor to be singled out. But that is where we are. And finally, the moratorium that I discussed first, that is not an insolvency procedure in of itself. It is a holding position to either a rescue or an insolvency procedure should that moratorium not work. So that's a quick canter through.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. And I think, again, the reason for just wanting to highlight that to a largely pensions audience is to make us all really understand that there are slightly different things going on here, and particularly important to understand if a debt's triggered or PPF assessment period's triggered. And in terms of then trying to work out how the trustee positions itself, those different things. But just conscious of time, and there are just two more questions that have come in that I'd just like to try and pick up if we can in the last few minutes. So one, if I can come back to you, Rachel, is this point about, well, we've heard all of this stuff as to where trustees are in these situations. What do you do in the good times to try and put yourself in a better position?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Jason. And one of which I've reflected with advisors after certain situations. So I think it can be summarised as 3 Ps, which are planning, processes and people. So on planning, there's no reason why trustee boards can't do the sort of scenario planning that we talked about earlier at any point, not just when it appears that they might be heading into a distressed covenant scenario. Document the output and then save it in case you need it later. It's unlikely you'll face the exact scenario that you've planned for, but at least you'll have a starting point, and many of the considerations and actions are similar across the various scenarios. Turning to processes and putting them in place in advance, one of the most important processes, of course, is covenant monitoring. Agree an appropriate and proportionate frequency and approach to this with the sponsor so that it becomes the norm in business as usual times. If you can, use an information sharing protocol so that there's clarity all round on what information is to be provided and when. And then if you are unfortunate enough to enter into a distressed scenario, you can dial up the frequency of that monitoring and then ideally turn it back down again if and when you get through that scenario. Other key processes to have in place are in advance are management of conflicts of interest, which of course all trustee boards need to do anyway, risk management and member communication. So in very practical terms, if you have to issue something quickly to members, who will produce that and practically how will you issue it? And then people, and we've talked about the advisory team and the trustee board earlier, and the sponsor, whenever possible, seek to build good working relationships in the business as usual times. And it's so much easier if you've got a good foundation going into a stressed scenario. And by that I mean in between the trustees themselves, with those who provide scheme management and secretarial advisors, and of course the sponsor. Also identify any other key stakeholders specific to the circumstances and aim to open a dialogue with them if you can.
Thanks, Rachel. And just picking up another question that's come through before we close, and that's whether you see any linkage to the new sort of long-term funding code coming through, longer term investment and funding strategies, and is there anything in that relates to the situations we've been discussing today?
Yeah, I think there is actually, Jason, and so what you're referring to is the draft regulations that have come out on funding and under those, trustees and sponsors will need to agree a funding and investment strategy for their scheme to achieve full funding with low dependency on the sponsor by the time the scheme reaches significant maturity. And in stressed scenarios, I think and particularly where the scheme is material in size compared with the sponsor, limited affordability might mean that full funding on a low dependency basis is actually some way off. And where you don't have visibility of the strength of the covenant all the way to the date for full funding, and actually it would be unusual for there to be 100% certainty about almost any sponsor covenant over, say, 7 to 10 year period and beyond, it comes back to contingency planning and determining whether there's anything that trustees can do either now or in future to mitigate the risk of any future insolvency before the long-term target is likely to be achieved.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm just conscious of time. We're just ticking up now to the hour, so I think we're probably just going to pull things to an end there. Many thanks both to you, Rachel, and to Tom for all your insights from the different backgrounds of both a pension trustee and also a restructuring and insolvency practitioner. I think an important thing for everyone to take away is the importance of understanding that context of the restructuring and the insolvency world, and that trustees do need to get very familiar and good understanding of what's going on. But also the points you both brought out really are, well, there's the technical pieces, but there's also clearly the human element and the strategic and tactical to think through. So I think that all came across really very, very clearly. So thank you for all of that. And I'll be practicing saying cross-class creditor cram down for the rest of the day. I think just about got there carefully. And thanks to all of you for joining this webinar. Any questions that I'm afraid we haven't answered, we will pick up separately and come back to you, and thank you for it. A reminder, you can watch the first webinar and download it on demand from the Gowling website and sign up to the third webinar that looks at protecting schemes in risk transfer, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks. Grateful for any feedback. It only takes a minute, and if you could give us that feedback, we're always very grateful to get that for next time and for future webinars. That's all from me. We're coming up to 1 o'clock. Thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Rachel and Tom, and have a good rest of the afternoon.